The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in. Every seat was filled, every breath held, every eye fixed on one man, Eric Carter. A man who had once worn the badge with honor, a man who had sworn to protect and serve, now stood as the accused. The weight of injustice pressed upon his shoulders as he awaited the judge's final words, his fate hanging by a fragile thread. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside, a cruel reminder that the world was still moving while Eric's life was paused, waiting for a verdict that could destroy him forever. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the judge began, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. This court finds the defendant, Eric Carter. The pause stretched for what felt like an eternity. Not guilty on all charges. For a brief moment, there was no reaction. The words floated in the air, almost as if they were waiting to be processed. Then, all at once, the courtroom erupted. Gasps of shock, shouts of victory, cries of relief. The gallery burst into motion. Some people clapped, others wept, a few stormed out in anger. Eric's legs felt weak, and he gripped the edge of the defense table to steady himself. It was over. After months of being vilified, of having his name dragged through the mud, of being treated like a criminal for simply doing what was right, he was free. Tears welled up in his mother Diana's eyes as she grabbed his arm. "Thank God," she whispered, voice trembling. She clutched his hand so tightly it almost hurt, as if afraid that if she let go, he would be taken from her again. Beside her, Vanessa Brooks, the investigative journalist who had fought relentlessly to uncover the truth, exhaled deeply, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had risked everything, her reputation, her career, to prove Eric's innocence. And now, justice had finally been served. But not everyone in the room shared their relief. Across the courtroom, Jake Mitchell, the officer responsible for framing Eric, sat motionless. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his chair. The same system that had protected him for years had finally turned its gaze on him. His lies had unraveled, his once powerful presence reduced to a hollow shell. The whispers grew louder as people filed out of the courtroom. Reporters rushed to the front, microphones and cameras at the ready. The world outside was waiting. Eric took a deep breath before stepping outside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, a roar of voices met him like a tidal wave. A sea of people stood gathered beyond the courthouse steps. Activists, supporters, curious onlookers, all waiting for him to speak. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Eric, how do you feel about the verdict?" How did he feel? He should be relieved. He should be celebrating. But deep inside, he knew that freedom wasn't enough. This wasn't just about him. He had been lucky. He had people who fought for him, who refused to let his story be buried. But what about the countless others who never got that chance? He turned to face the crowd, his voice steady but firm. "I was lucky enough to prove my innocence. But what about those who never get that chance? What about those still fighting, still suffering? This isn't just about me. We can't stop here." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. "Chance of justice for all," echoed down the courthouse steps. People held up signs bearing his name, his image, messages of solidarity and hope. Eric felt Vanessa's hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. And she was right. That night, he sat in his mother's small living room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The TV played news coverage of his trial in the background, but he wasn't watching. His mind was racing. He had spent months fighting for his freedom, but now that he had it, what was next? Could he just go back to living a normal life? Pretend none of this had ever happened? No. He couldn't walk away. The system was broken, and he had seen its cracks firsthand. If he turned his back now, it would happen again, to someone else, to another innocent person caught in the machine of corruption and power. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Vanessa. "We need to talk. I have an idea." Moments later, his phone buzzed with her reply. "I was hoping you'd say that." Eric looked out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. He had been a victim, but now he was something more. He was a fighter, and this fight was just getting started. Eric sat in the dimly lit cafe across from Vanessa, his fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. The weight of the past few months still clung to him. But there was something else now, a spark of determination. "I don't just want to move on," Eric said finally, breaking the silence between them. His voice was steady, resolved. "I want to do something. I need to do something." Vanessa nodded, leaning in. "You're already a symbol, Eric. People see you as proof that justice can prevail. But they also know that for every person like you, there are hundreds who don't get a fair trial, who don't get any justice at all. That's exactly why I can't just walk away," Eric said. He ran a hand through his hair, the exhaustion evident in his face. "I can't be okay with the fact that I only got out of this because of luck, because of you, because of the few people who stood by me. That's not how justice is supposed to work." Vanessa took a slow sip of her coffee, studying him. She had spent months exposing the corruption that led to his arrest. She had witnessed the system try to break him. And yet, here he was, not broken but stronger. "What's the plan?" she asked, setting her cup down. Eric exhaled sharply, as if the weight of his thoughts had been suffocating him. "I want to start something, a foundation, an initiative, something real. A place where people like me, people who've been wrongfully accused or mistreated by the system, can find support. Legal aid, resources, education. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did, feeling like they have no one to fight for them." Vanessa's eyes flickered with admiration. "That's ambitious," she admitted. "And it won't be easy. The same people who wanted to see you locked up will fight tooth and nail to keep you from making real change." Eric met her gaze. "Let them try." She smirked. "All right then, let's do this." That was the night Carter's Hope was born, not just as an idea, but as a movement. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Eric and Vanessa worked tirelessly, gathering support, reaching out to activists, and speaking at community events. Word spread quickly. Donations trickled in, volunteers signed up, and before long, Carter's Hope was more than just a dream. It was a reality. The first headquarters was set up in a modest but welcoming space in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood that had long been neglected. The building had once been an abandoned community center, but with some help from volunteers, it was transformed into something new, a safe haven for those seeking justice. One afternoon, as Eric was helping to paint the center's entrance, a group of teenagers wandered by, watching curiously. Among them was a boy named Darius, no older than 16, his arms crossed over his chest as he studied Eric. "You're that guy from the trial," Darius said finally. There was a note of skepticism in his voice. Eric set down his brush and wiped his hands on his jeans before turning to face the boy. "Yeah," he said. "That's me." Darius shifted his weight. "Why are you doing all this?" Eric met his gaze, seeing the guarded expression, the wariness. He recognized it because he had once worn that same look, the look of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. "Because I know what it feels like to think the system is built against you," Eric said honestly. "And I don't want anyone else to feel like they're fighting alone." Darius didn't respond right away, but something in his expression softened. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Guess I'll stick around and see if this place is really what you say it is." Eric smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As Carter's Hope grew, so did its impact. More and more people began to come forward with their own stories. Stories of wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and police brutality. Some came seeking help, others came wanting to help. Eric found himself speaking at more events, meeting with politicians, pushing for reforms. He had once been just another officer in the system, but now he was fighting to change it from the outside. But change didn't come without resistance. One evening, as Eric locked up the center, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. A distorted voice came through the speaker. "You need to stop." Eric's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter," the voice said. "What matters is that you're making a lot of people uncomfortable. You won your case. Take your freedom and walk away. Or next time, you might not be so lucky." The call ended. Eric stood there for a long moment, staring at the darkened screen. He had known this would happen. He had expected it, but he wasn't afraid. Instead, he texted Vanessa. "We need to talk. It's starting." Her response came immediately. "Then let's make sure we're ready." In the weeks that followed, Carter's Hope became more than just a center. It became a movement. Protests grew stronger, policy changes were demanded, and for the first time in years, it felt like something was shifting. Even the police department, once untouchable, was now facing scrutiny. Internal investigations were being launched, and officers who had long abused their power were finally being held accountable. Among them was Jake Mitchell. The man who had once framed Eric was now the one under investigation. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Years of misconduct, falsified reports, and abuse of power had finally caught up to him. Eric sat in a meeting room at the center when Vanessa walked in, holding up her phone. "Jake was arrested today," she said, her expression unreadable. "They're charging him with multiple counts of misconduct, evidence tampering, and excessive force." Eric nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. "This was never about revenge," he said. "It's about making sure people like him don't get to do this anymore." Vanessa studied him for a moment before smiling. "You really are something else, Carter." Eric chuckled. "That's what my mom says, too." She shook her head, amusement in her eyes. "So what now?" Eric leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Now." He looked out the window, where people were gathered outside the center, talking, laughing, planning. "Now we keep going." Because this wasn't just about one man's fight for justice anymore. It was about changing the system, and they were just getting started. The walls of Carter's Hope echoed with the sounds of change. Footsteps hurried through the halls. Voices of volunteers filled the air, and the energy in the building was electric. What had started as an idea was now a full-fledged movement. Eric had always believed in justice, but now he was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for an entire community. The trial of Jake Mitchell had sent shockwaves through the city. He wasn't just facing charges for what he had done to Eric. His entire history as a corrupt officer was now under scrutiny. Old cases were being reopened, victims were stepping forward, and the very foundation of the police department was shaking. Eric stood at the front of a packed community hall, addressing a group of people who had come seeking help. Some were families of victims, others were activists, and many were simply concerned citizens who wanted to be part of something bigger. "We are here today because injustice has gone unchecked for too long," Eric said, his voice firm. "We are not just fighting for a single case or a single name. We are fighting for every person who has been silenced, every person who has been told that their story doesn't matter." That changes now. Applause rippled through the crowd. Vanessa stood near the back, watching with quiet pride. She had seen Eric transform from a man trying to clear his name into a leader who was inspiring thousands. After the meeting, Eric and Vanessa sat in a small office, reviewing reports. The number of people reaching out to Carter's Hope had grown exponentially. Legal teams had volunteered their services, donations were pouring in, and even local politicians had started paying attention. Vanessa tapped her fingers against the desk. "Eric, you do realize that this isn't just about one city anymore, right? We're making national headlines. People in other states are talking about Carter's Hope." Eric exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I know. But this isn't just about me or about this city. This is about real change." She nodded. "Then we need to think bigger." That evening, Eric walked through the community center, watching as volunteers helped young people with their studies, as legal teams reviewed cases, and as families sat together in the common areas, sharing stories of resilience and survival. Near the entrance, he spotted Darius, the teenager who had once been skeptical about Carter's Hope. He was now sitting with a group of younger kids, helping them with their homework. Eric approached him with a smirk. "Didn't think you'd stick around this long." Darius shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Didn't think you were for real at first, but you proved me wrong." Eric chuckled. "Glad to hear it." He glanced at the books spread out on the table. "What are you working on?" "History," Darius said, flipping a page. "We're learning about civil rights movements. Kind of crazy how stuff that happened back then still feels like it's happening now." Eric's expression grew serious. "That's because the fight never really ended. People just got better at ignoring it. But that's why we're here, to make sure no one can ignore it anymore." Darius nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting newfound understanding. As the months passed, Carter's Hope continued to grow. Offices were set up in other cities, collaborations with legal organizations expanded, and the movement took on a life of its own. Eric found himself traveling frequently, speaking at events, meeting with policymakers, and pushing for reforms that could make a lasting impact. But not everyone welcomed the change. One afternoon, as Eric was leaving a meeting with local officials, he noticed a black SUV idling nearby. At first, he thought nothing of it, but when it followed him for several blocks, he knew something was off. He stopped at a coffee shop and turned around, watching as the SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. Eric hesitated before answering. "Careful, Carter," a voice said. Low, threatening. "You're making too much noise." Eric's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" A dry chuckle. "Just someone who's been watching. You got lucky once. Don't push it." The call ended. Eric stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. But fear didn't consume him. If anything, it fueled him. He had known from the start that taking on the system wouldn't be easy. And he wasn't about to back down now. He immediately called Vanessa. "We need to be careful," he told her. "They're watching." Vanessa's voice was steady. "Let them watch. We're not hiding." The threats didn't stop, but neither did Carter's hope. More and more cases were being won, policies were changing, and even law enforcement agencies were being forced to acknowledge the problems within their own ranks. One evening, as Eric was finishing up work at the center, an unexpected visitor arrived. Jake Mitchell, the former officer, stood in the doorway, looking almost unrecognizable. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. He looked worn down, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. Eric studied him carefully. "You're either really brave or really stupid for showing up here." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe both." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I needed to see it for myself." Eric folded his arms. "See what?" Jake gestured around the room. "This. What you built. I spent years using the system against people like you. And now, I don't even recognize the city anymore." Eric narrowed his eyes. "Is that regret I hear?" Jake sighed. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to say this. To your face. I was wrong." He swallowed hard. "And I'm paying for it now." For a long moment, Eric didn't speak. Then, finally, he nodded, acknowledging it as a start. But words don't mean much without action. Jake nodded. "I know." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, you did what I never could. You changed things." Eric watched him go, exhaling slowly. Change was happening, but the fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, Eric stood before a crowd at a press conference, cameras flashing, microphones lined up in front of him. The city's mayor had just announced a series of major police reforms, many of them influenced by the work of Carter's Hope. Eric stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. "This isn't the end of the fight," he said. "But today we take another step forward. Not just for me, not just for the city, but for everyone who has ever been denied justice. We will not be silent. We will not back down. And we will not stop until justice isn't just a dream. It's a reality." The crowd erupted into applause. Eric glanced at Vanessa, who nodded in approval. Then he looked out over the sea of faces, knowing that this was just the beginning. Because the fight for justice was far from over. The reforms were just the beginning. Across the city, policies were shifting, officers were undergoing new training, and communities were becoming more involved in shaping the justice system. But Eric knew that real change wasn't just about laws. It was about people. One evening, as he walked through the bustling halls of Carter's Hope, he spotted a young boy standing in the corner, clutching a worn notebook. The boy looked familiar, but Eric couldn't quite place him. He had an intense look of concentration as he whispered under his breath, as if rehearsing something. Eric approached with a warm smile. "Hey there, what are you working on?" The boy looked up, startled. Then his face lit up with excitement. "Mr. Carter, I'm writing a speech about you." Eric raised an eyebrow, surprised. "About me?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. "For school. We have to write about someone who inspires us. I picked you." A deep warmth spread through Eric's chest. He crouched down to the boy's level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That means a lot. But you know what? You don't have to be like me. You can be even better." The boy beamed. "Really?" Eric nodded. "Absolutely. And when the time comes, I'll be there to hear that speech." As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling of pride that settled in his chest. Carter's Hope wasn't just a center, it was a symbol, a place where kids could dream of futures they never thought possible. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Eric worked tirelessly, collaborating with activists and lawmakers to push reforms beyond his own city. He traveled across the country, speaking at universities, meeting with policymakers, and ensuring that the momentum didn't fade. One evening, he found himself back at Carter's Hope, sitting on the steps outside the building. The air was cool, the sky speckled with stars. He had spent the entire day in meetings, discussing the expansion of community programs, and now he finally had a moment to breathe. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "You've overcome every obstacle to change an entire system. I'm proud of you." Eric smiled, setting the phone aside. He knew his journey was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. With the support of his community and his unshakable belief in justice, he pressed forward, determined to build a future where fairness wasn't just an idea, it was a reality. A year had passed since Eric Carter's acquittal. The city, once plagued by division, had transformed. The air felt lighter, the streets more hopeful. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, people believed that change was possible. On this bright morning, the central square was packed with people. Hundreds had gathered to celebrate the anniversary of a victory that had shaken the very foundation of the system. Banners waved high, carrying powerful messages. Unity is strength. Justice never sleeps. Hope wins. The air buzzed with energy. Laughter and music mingled with the rustling of banners, creating an atmosphere of triumph. Behind the curtains of the stage, Eric adjusted his tie. He could hear the roar of the crowd, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. His mother, Diana, stood nearby, watching him with quiet pride. "You've come so far," she murmured, brushing a hand over his shoulder. Eric exhaled deeply. "We all have." A few feet away, Vanessa Brooks caught his eye. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. "You ready?" she asked. Eric smiled. "Always." As he stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The sheer force of their support hit him like a wave, filling him with an indescribable energy. He paused, taking in the sea of faces. Faces of people who had stood beside him through the darkest of days. His eyes shimmered with emotion as he raised the microphone. "Today," he began, his voice steady but filled with passion, "we are not just celebrating my victory. We are celebrating the power of unity." The crowd cheered. "A year ago, I stood before a court, falsely accused. I was told that the truth wouldn't matter, that justice was a luxury, not a right. But because of you, all of you, I did not fall." Applause shook the square. Some people raised their fists, others chanted his name. Eric took a deep breath, letting the emotion settle before continuing. "This victory is not just mine. It belongs to every person who has ever been marginalized, dismissed, or silenced. Today, we prove that justice is not just a dream. It is a goal, one worth fighting for." A wave of applause rolled through the crowd, stronger than before. Eric saw tears in the eyes of some, determination in others. He shifted his stance, his expression turning serious. "Over the past year, we have seen real change. Jake Mitchell, who once used his power to intimidate and oppress, has not only faced his initial charges, but has also been prosecuted for past offenses. This isn't just about holding one man accountable. It's about holding an entire system accountable." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some people shouted their approval. Body cameras are now mandatory for all officers in this state. An independent investigative agency has been established to oversee misconduct cases. Anti-bias training programs have been implemented, ensuring that law enforcement understands the communities they serve. The crowd erupted once more. Eric's eyes landed on a group of teenagers sitting in the front row. Among them was Darius, watching with rapt attention. To the younger generation, Eric said, his voice ringing with conviction, "I have one message. Never let anyone tell you that you can't change the world. Because you can. And I stand here today as proof that every dream can come true, if you dare to act." Darius stood suddenly, raising his fist high. The crowd responded instantly, chanting in unison, "Justice, unity, hope." Eric smiled, feeling the energy surge through the square. This was more than just a speech. This was a movement. After the ceremony, Eric mingled with the crowd, shaking hands, embracing old friends. An elderly woman approached, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Eric," she said softly, gripping his hands, "you're not just a hero of that trial. You've rekindled hope we thought we had lost long ago." Eric bowed his head, humbled. He refused to let the praise cloud his focus. There was still work to do. That afternoon, he returned to Carter's Hope, watching as children played, studied, and trained. The center had become a haven, a place where dreams were nurtured, where hope flourished. On the main wall, a newly completed mural now stood. It depicted Eric, his fist raised high, surrounded by people from all walks of life. Beneath it, powerful words were etched. "Justice is not just a dream, it's action." Eric knew his mission wasn't over. He would continue working with reform councils, pushing for change, and building centers like Carter's Hope nationwide. One evening, as he sifted through mail sent to the center, he came across a letter from a boy in another state. "Dear Eric, your story changed my life. I used to think I didn't have a chance. But because of you, I've decided to become a lawyer, to help people like you." Eric read the letter again, feeling the true weight of his journey. This was why he fought, and he would not stop, and he would not stop. The fight for justice had never been just about Eric Carter. It had grown beyond him, beyond the case, beyond the courtroom. It had become a movement, a force of change that was reshaping laws, policies, and most importantly, mindsets. The reforms that followed were unlike anything the city had seen before. Mandatory body cameras were now enforced for all officers, ensuring accountability in every interaction. An independent investigative agency had been established, one that could no longer be swayed by police unions or internal cover-ups. Anti-bias training was no longer just a formality. It had become an essential requirement for every officer in the department. But perhaps the most powerful change was happening within the communities themselves. Inspired by Carter's Hope, similar youth centers were being established across the state, designed to empower young people with opportunities that had once seemed out of reach. One afternoon, as Eric walked through the grounds of Carter's Hope, he noticed a young boy standing in the shade of a tree. The boy clutched a stack of papers, whispering words to himself, his small hands trembling slightly. Eric approached with curiosity. "What are you working on?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with recognition. "Mr. Carter, I'm practicing a speech. About you." A chuckle escaped Eric as he knelt beside him. "About me?" The boy nodded eagerly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Eric felt something tighten in his chest. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to be like me," he said with a warm smile. "You can be better." The boy's eyes shone with hope. "Really?" "Absolutely." Eric squeezed his shoulder. "And I'll be here to see it happen." As he stood and walked away, a sense of purpose filled him. This was why he fought, not just for himself, not just for justice, but for the next generation. In the months that followed, Eric's efforts didn't slow down. If anything, he pushed harder. He worked with activists, lawyers, and politicians, ensuring that reforms didn't stop at just one city. The movement had gained national attention, inspiring similar initiatives in cities across the country. Eric had become more than just a man who had fought for justice. He had become a symbol of change. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Eric found himself sitting outside the center, gazing up at the starry sky. The world had changed so much in a year. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "You've overcome every obstacle to change an entire system. I'm proud of you." Eric smiled, setting the phone aside. He knew his journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still people who needed justice. But for the first time in a long time, he knew he wasn't alone. With the support of his community, he pressed forward, determined to build a future where justice was not a privilege, but a right for all. 1 year later, the city had changed, visibly, radically, permanently, asterisk, asterisk. And today, it was celebrating. The central square was packed with people. Hundreds, maybe thousands, had gathered, waving banners with words that had become the foundation of this movement. Justice never sleeps. Unity is strength. Carter's hope lives on. The energy in the air was electric. Laughter, conversation, and the sound of music filled the space. The celebration wasn't just about Eric. It was about every person who had stood up for justice and won. Backstage, Eric adjusted his tie. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but he took a steadying breath. His mother, Diana, stood nearby, her eyes glistening with pride. "You've come so far," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Eric exhaled, his chest rising with emotion. "We all have." A few feet away, Vanessa Brooks caught his gaze. She gave him an encouraging nod. "You ready?" Eric smiled. "Always." The moment he stepped onto the stage, the cheers erupted, a thunderous wave of support that sent shivers down his spine. He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. These were the people who had stood by him, the people who had refused to let the system crush him. Holding the microphone tightly, he began, "Today, we are not just celebrating my victory," Eric said, his voice strong and unwavering. "We are celebrating the power of unity." A ripple of cheers spread through the crowd. "A year ago, I stood before a court, facing false accusations. They told me the truth didn't matter. That justice was a luxury, not a right." Eric's voice grew firmer. "But because of you, because of every person who refused to stay silent, I am standing here today." Applause shook the square. Eric took a steadying breath. "This victory is not just mine. It belongs to every single person who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or oppressed. We have proven that justice is not just a dream. It is a goal worth fighting for." The crowd roared, fists raised in solidarity. Eric's tone shifted. He spoke directly, powerfully. "In the past year, we have seen real, lasting change. Jake Mitchell, the officer who tried to destroy my life, has not only faced justice but has been held accountable for past offenses as well." The crowd murmured in agreement. "This was never just about punishing one man," Eric continued. "It was about changing the system. And we did." More cheers. Body cameras are now mandatory. An independent investigative agency now ensures accountability. New training programs are teaching officers to serve, not oppress. Eric's gaze landed on the young people in the front row. Darius sat among them, his eyes bright with determination. "To the next generation," Eric said, voice steady and fierce, "I have one message. Never let anyone tell you that you can't change the world. Because you can." Darius stood, raising his fist high. The crowd exploded into chants. Justice, unity, hope. Eric felt a rush of emotion as he watched the people, the movement he had fought for. After the ceremony, Eric mingled with the crowd, embracing old friends, shaking hands with strangers who now felt like family. An elderly woman approached, tears welling in her eyes. "Eric," she said softly, "you're not just a hero of that trial. You've rekindled a hope we thought we had lost long ago." Eric bowed his head, humbled. He refused to let praise distract him. There was still work to do. That afternoon, he returned to Carter's Hope, watching his children played, studied, and dreamed. The center had become more than a place. It had become a movement. On the main wall, a new mural had been completed. It depicted Eric, his fist raised high, surrounded by people from all walks of life. Beneath it, powerful words were etched. "Justice is not just a dream, it's action." That evening, as Eric stood on the rooftop, he gazed out at the city. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "You've accomplished what few dare to dream. But remember, the fight isn't over." Eric smiled, setting the phone aside. He knew his journey wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever faced injustice. And he wasn't stopping now. Eric Carter's story proves that one voice can spark a movement. But the fight for justice isn't over. What do you think? Can real change happen if we stand together? Let us know in the comments. Fire if this story inspired you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to light. Together, we can make a difference.